She hit the ice before the echo of the blast caught up. The air was gone, replaced by dust, metal, and the wet crack of her breath freezing mid-shout. The ridge had given way under the weight of trust, and somewhere below, the radio kept hissing a name. No one answered. She tasted copper, felt the grit in her teeth, the rotor wash long gone, but she moved, 1 inch, then another, muscle over pain, control over panic. In the dark, she learned the truth every survivor does. Endurance isn't motion. It's silence mastered. This is the fall at Kear's Ridge. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, because this wasn't about survival. It was about what you do after you've already fallen. At 0500 hours, the wind rolled down from the mountains like a living thing, sharp, restless, and cold enough to harden the breath of every Marine standing in formation. Frost covered the ground in a brittle sheet, glinting beneath the dull glow of sodium floodlights. Beyond the wire, antenna towers stood rimmed in ice, their steel bones humming faintly against the gusts that swept across the frozen Montana plain. The compound was silent except for the low hum of a generator and the occasional metallic groan of a flagpole under strain. Captain Aaron Mallory stood a few paces from the line, still and silent, her breath barely visible. She wore no expression, no visible discomfort, and that alone set her apart. Her posture was composed, shoulders back, gloved hands clasped behind her. Around her, the morning ritual unfolded with textbook precision, boots aligned, rifles inspected, orders murmured between ranks. But beneath the ritual, there was tension, quiet and coiled, like a taut wire humming under frost. Lieutenant Marcus Hale observed from the periphery, his eyes sharp and questioning. He was younger than his bearing suggested, ambitious, proud, and uneasy with what he did not control. Beside him, Gunnery Sergeant Cole Barrett moved with the mechanical ease of long habit, his tone clipped, his commands cold as the air. The two shared an unspoken skepticism, exchanged through brief glances and half-measured silence. Mallory was an outsider, a headquarters officer sent to observe their program, not a Marine who had earned her way through their mud, their storms, or their years. To them, she was a stranger with authority, and that made her dangerous. The briefing that morning was not loud. Orders were spoken evenly, checked twice, confirmed once more before the sound of boots on gravel resumed. Yet beneath that order lived something else, the awareness of eyes on every movement, every breath. Mallory's calm presence unsettled the rhythm of command. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She simply observed. And in the absence of words, her silence became louder than any reprimand could have been. Snow began to fall, fine, dry, and silent. It gathered along the edges of helmets and rifles, over the curve of the vehicles lined in the motor pool. The hum of the compound dulled beneath it, as if the entire world were muffled under the weight of expectation. Barrett adjusted his gloves, pretending not to watch her. Hale shifted once, jaw tightening. They'd expected a speech, or perhaps some form of inspection, anything to break the uneasy quiet. Instead, Mallory turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the formation. Her movements were deliberate, methodical, entirely without aggression. She didn't look for fault. She measured discipline through stillness, through the minute tremor of a boot or the drift of an eye. The cold cut through every layer of uniform. Still, she remained unmoved, a fixed point in the frozen air. Her calm wasn't defiance. It was authority distilled to its simplest form. She said nothing, and by doing so, she commanded everything. The Marines shifted subtly under her gaze. They didn't yet understand her purpose, but they felt it. The weight of a standard unspoken, yet absolute. In that moment, Hale's confidence thinned. Barrett's pride hardened into something defensive. They didn't see a visiting officer anymore. They saw a mirror held too steady, reflecting what discipline truly looked like. As the formation dismissed, boots striking frost and gravel. Mallory remained. The wind lifted the loose edge of her coat, carrying a whisper of snow through the open yard. Hale hesitated, glancing back once. Barrett followed his gaze, neither speaking, neither understanding the discomfort that silence had carved into them. By 600 hours. The light began to break through the cloud cover, pale, unforgiving, and sharp. The compound stirred again, the routine reasserting itself. Yet beneath the order, beneath the rhythm of discipline, something had shifted. Captain Erin Mallory stood alone in the wind, the frost refracting sunlight around her boots. She hadn't said a word, but her stillness had drawn the first line in a quiet battle neither Hale nor Barrett yet recognized. The wind swept across the compound once more, lifting a trail of snow that coiled and vanished, a visual echo of tension waiting to break. Steel buckets clattered across the frost-bitten concrete, the sound carrying sharp and metallic in the cold Montana air. The wind had teeth that morning, dragging through the yard and scraping frost from the edges of the bleachers. Breath hung thick and visible around the Marines gathering for field drills, another day of discipline, repetition, and endurance. The compound seemed frozen in time, its rhythm mechanical and unforgiving. Captain Erin Mallory stood where she always did, on the perimeter, silent and unmoving, eyes scanning every motion like a metronome of control. The Marines had grown used to her presence, but not comfortable with it. There was something in her restraint that unsettled them, the way she seemed immune to weather, ego, and exhaustion alike. Lieutenant Marcus Hale watched her from the edge of the formation, jaw set. His voice carried authority that morning, crisp and deliberate. Behind him, Gunnery Sergeant Cole Barrett oversaw preparations, expression fixed in the practiced calm of a man who had seen every kind of test but disliked being tested himself. The two shared a quiet understanding. This was their ground, their unit, their rhythm. And Mallory's calm, her still-eyed observation, felt like intrusion. She didn't bark orders. She didn't correct them. She simply recorded, measured, noted every hesitation, every motion of command. Her silence pressed on them more heavily than inspection. The frost on the gravel cracked beneath boots as the Marines assembled in a half circle. The morning drill was framed as a leadership test, a demonstration of adaptability in adverse conditions. But underneath, pride hummed like static. Hale's voice was even, his tone controlled, but the challenge he arranged wasn't about tactics. It was theater, a statement dressed as instruction. The barrels were filled with water, ice thickening along the rims. Barrett oversaw the setup, his gloved hands red and raw from the cold. The test, he explained, would demonstrate composure under pressure. No words of warning, no clear intent. Just motion, precision, without meaning. Mallory's eyes followed every step, calm and observant. The men around her shifted subtly, aware of the imbalance. The kind of moment when respect and pride began to blur into rivalry. When Hale finally turned toward her, the compound seemed to exhale. His posture was confident, almost rehearsed, an officer asserting control in front of subordinates. Without announcement, one of the buckets tipped. The sound of ice water hitting the frozen ground was abrupt, shattering the morning silence. Then another followed, the shock of cold spraying across boots, gravel, and her uniform. The impact should have drawn reaction, movement, anything. But Captain Erin Mallory didn't flinch. The air thickened. Laughter began, uncertain at first, then rising, rough and uncomfortable. It cut short when it became clear she wasn't moving. Water dripped from her collar, running along the folds of her coat, freezing in thin, crystalline lines that glinted under the early light. Her breath was steady. Her posture never changed. Her eyes, calm, unwavering, stayed fixed ahead, as if the moment had passed before it even began. The silence returned sharper than before. The cold carried sound differently now, every shift of boot leather, Every drop of freezing water landing on the concrete was a kind of echo. Hale's confidence faltered. Barrett looked away first. The laughter had died without command, replaced by something heavier. Awareness. Maybe shame. The Marines standing nearby sensed it too, the slow reversal of power that comes not from words or punishment, but from composure, unbroken. Mallory's restraint became a mirror again, reflecting everything back at them. The prank that was meant to diminish her now revealed something else, a strength without noise, authority without performance. She didn't need to correct them. She didn't even acknowledge the act. A gust of wind tore through the compound, scattering thin shards of ice from the ground. Her uniform clung with frozen weight, but she remained still, breathing slow, controlled. There was no anger, no visible pride, only endurance, the kind that turns silence into judgment. Barrett's voice, once commanding, stayed quiet. Hale gave an order to dismiss the formation, but even that carried no conviction. The Marines moved quickly, boots crunching through frost, avoiding her gaze as they passed. Mallory stood alone again. The water froze at her feet, catching the light like glass. Around her, the compound returned to order, but the rhythm had changed. The air felt thinner, colder. The authority in that yard had shifted, even if no one yet dared to name it. She lifted a gloved hand, brushed a flake of ice from her sleeve, and turned toward the horizon. The wind caught her coat as she walked, the motion slow, deliberate, composed. Behind her, silence lingered like fog, heavy, dense, unresolved. It wasn't victory. It was something deeper. The frost along the barrels began to reform, glimmering under the pale sunlight. The compound breathed again, but the balance of power had been quietly rewritten, and in that frozen yard, with laughter long gone and pride turned brittle, the first crack of realization took hold. The compound held its breath. Frost whispered against the metal siding of the barracks, a low, hollow sound like distant static. The laughter that had filled the morning was gone, swallowed by silence. Only the wind moved now, curling around the formation yard, carrying the faint rattle of a loose chain against a flagpole. Captain Aaron Mallory stood where they had left her, soaked, rigid, her uniform stiff with ice. She hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted. Around her, the Marines avoided looking too long, caught between discomfort and disbelief. It was the kind of quiet that made a man hear his own heartbeat. Lieutenant Marcus Hale lingered at the front of the group, posture straight, but breathing shallow. He felt the weight of eyes behind him. Barrett's, the platoon's, even hers. Every lesson on control he had ever drilled into his Marines now felt like something she embodied better than he could teach. The clock ticked toward 0800 hours. Training wasn't paused, though everything felt suspended. Hale called the next sequence with a voice steady but colder than before. His words hung in the air without conviction, falling flat against the frozen morning. Mallory moved. It was nothing dramatic, just one step forward, slow and deliberate. The crunch of ice beneath her boots breaking the static air. Her gloved hands unclasped behind her back as she walked toward the training line. She didn't look at Hale or Barrett, and she didn't need to. Every pair of eyes followed her movement, not because of rank, but because of presence. She stopped near the obstacle range, where a line of weighted dummies stood under frost. The Marines watched as she reached for one, her movements efficient, silent, unhurried. She adjusted her footing, left forward, right grounded, and then, in one seamless motion, dropped the dummy with a technique that spoke of precision honed by repetition beyond their experience. The thud was heavy, final, echoing across the yard. She reset the dummy, repeated the maneuver, faster this time, cleaner. There was no wasted energy, no anger in it, just control. Every joint, every breath was accounted for. The Marines exchanged looks. Barrett's arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Hale tried to stay composed. But there was tension now, an awareness that whatever this was, it wasn't performance. It was demonstration. When Mallory moved to the pull-up bar, frost crackled under her boots. She stripped off her gloves, tossed them aside, and grabbed the cold metal. Her fingers locked, steady and exact. Then she began. There was rhythm in her motion, no strain, no visible effort, the kind of precision that comes from years of training, not months of conditioning. 20 reps, then 30. The air turned colder around her, but she didn't slow. Her breath came steady, measured, almost silent. When she finally dropped down, her boots hit the ground like punctuation. She turned toward the formation again. Still no words. Barrett shifted, his jaw tightening as memory began to stir, a familiarity in her stance, in the crispness of her movements. Something from years before, whispered through the training pipelines. Stories of instructors who didn't speak, who broke recruits down without ever raising a voice. Mallory moved again, this time toward the weapons rack. Her hand brushed frost from the stock of an M4, and for a moment she paused. The light caught the side of her wrist, just above the glove line, and something dark appeared beneath the pale skin, a small, inked shape. A trident. It wasn't large, barely visible, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that silenced an entire formation. The realization spread slowly, like warmth through cold water. Barrett's eyes locked on it first, then Hale's. Neither spoke, neither moved. The wind filled the space where words might have been. She continued checking the weapon, methodical, precise, not performing now, simply doing what she knew. Every motion was clean, instinctive. The kind of familiarity that comes from living the process, not studying it. The silence thickened. Around her, Marine stood straighter without knowing why. Respect had shifted, quiet and complete. Mallory re-secured the weapon, set it down with care, and turned back toward the formation. The frost on her uniform had begun to melt, dripping slowly from her sleeve. She adjusted her coat cuff, almost absently, revealing the trident once more. It was no longer rumor or rank that defined her. It was truth, undeniable, earned, and now visible. The same trident that marked her as a former Navy SEAL instructor, one of the few who had trained men exactly like them, in programs designed to test will, not ego. No one had expected the calm officer from headquarters to be the architect of their doctrine. Yet, here she stood, the quiet foundation of everything they claimed to master. The air shifted again. Pride dissolved into something heavier, humility, perhaps even guilt. Hale's chest felt tight, his throat dry. Barrett looked down briefly, a man confronting a truth he didn't want but couldn't ignore. Mallory didn't linger on the reaction. She stepped back into her original position, posture composed, gaze steady. Her silence didn't feel cold anymore. It felt deliberate, earned, the kind of control that didn't need to prove itself. The Marines who had watched her with skepticism now looked with something closer to reverence. The hierarchy hadn't changed on paper, but the meaning of respect had. She turned once more toward the flagpole, where the chain still rattled in the wind. Her hand lifted to her brow, a crisp, quiet salute, perfectly executed. It wasn't directed at anyone. It was for the principle itself, for composure, for discipline, for everything the morning had tried to erode. The gesture said what her silence never needed to authority isn't volume. Strength isn't dominance. Leadership isn't ego. The moment held. No one moved. No one dared speak. Then she turned and walked away, boots crunching over frost, each step deliberate and even. Behind her, the formation remained at attention without command. The sound of the wind filled the space, softer now, almost reverent. Hale's gaze followed her until she disappeared into the light beyond the motor pool. Barrett exhaled once, The kind of breath that carried realization, that everything they thought they knew about control had just been rewritten. The compound, for a moment, felt sacred. It wasn't the silence of shame anymore. It was the silence of respect. And within that stillness, Captain Aaron Mallory's composure became something immortal, the quiet force that outlasted pride, rank, and winter itself. The first sound was boots on gravel, slow, deliberate, measured against the weight of cold air. Frost still clung to the compound, though the light had shifted. Dawn had arrived without warmth, spilling pale gold across the training yard where the events of the previous day lingered like a ghost. The Marines stood assembled once more, their breath rising in rhythmic clouds. The silence wasn't discipline now. It was contrition. Colonel James Bishop approached through the mist. His presence didn't need volume. Years of command had carved authority into his movement, shoulders squared, eyes scanning, pace unhurried, the kind of calm that made lesser men straighten instinctively. The wind carried his arrival across the compound before his shadow even touched them. Lieutenant Hale stood rigid at the front of the line, every muscle coiled in restraint. Gunnery Sergeant Barrett beside him, jaw locked tight. Neither man spoke. The prank, the humiliation, had spread beyond the wire overnight. The compound felt smaller now, its silence heavier. Bishop stopped a few paces before them. The frost cracked softly under his boots. The Marines held their posture, eyes fixed forward, but the weight of his gaze pressed like stone. He surveyed the yard, the frozen barrels, the training equipment, the stillness that hung between duty and guilt. Captain Aaron Mallory stood apart, as she had before, posture composed, face unreadable. The early light caught her sleeve, where remnants of ice still clung, glittering faintly. There was no defiance in her stance, no pride, only quiet order. The wind tugged at her coat, and the sunlight framed her breath in thin vapor. Bishop's eyes rested on her for a long moment. He didn't need a briefing. The story was already written in posture, in silence, in the way every Marine refused to meet her gaze. It was the kind of truth command doesn't request. It recognizes. He stepped forward once more, his movement precise, the gravel crunching in slow cadence. His presence drew the compound tighter. The air seemed to contract. Even the wind paused. Authority didn't raise its voice that morning. It didn't need to. The reckoning came not as reprimand, but as recognition. The colonel's eyes passed over Hale, over Barrett, then back to Mallory, weighing not blame, but lesson. He had seen this before, pride mistaking composure for fragility, strength misjudged because it didn't announce itself. Mallory's stillness told him everything. He gave a small nod, not approval, not comfort, but acknowledgement. A gesture between professionals who understood that leadership is a test that never ends. It was enough. The Marines behind Hale shifted slightly, boots creaking. Embarrassment was a quiet teacher. None of them had slept well. The frost under their boots shimmered with sunlight that made everything look sharper, almost clean again. Bishop turned toward Hale. The lieutenant's composure faltered for just a heartbeat, his jaw flexing under the weight of expectation. Barrett's throat tightened. Both knew words were unnecessary. Their failure wasn't procedural, it was moral. And the silence that followed wasn't mercy. It was judgment. Mallory remained still. Her gaze never left the horizon. Not out of dismissal, but out of discipline. She had already endured the cold, the humiliation, the disbelief. There was nothing left to prove. Bishop's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. He had read her file months ago, her record buried beneath commendations, the years she had spent training men to survive where others didn't. She had written the very standards these Marines now struggled to uphold. The irony wasn't lost on him. He took one step closer to her. The morning light cut across his face, revealing the faint exhaustion of command, the kind that knows how easily pride corrodes purpose. He looked at her, and for a moment, The rank between them disappeared. What remained was mutual respect, forged through endurance and silence. Mallory brought her hand to her brow, a salute clean and deliberate. Bishop returned it, slow and exact. The moment hung suspended, an exchange of understanding more absolute than words could carry. The Marines stood unmoving, witnesses to a restoration they didn't yet fully grasp. Authority had returned to its rightful form, not in punishment, but in principle. Respect wasn't demanded, it was relearned. The colonel's gaze swept the formation once more. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the main building. The rhythm of his boots faded into the wind, leaving order in his wake. Mallory remained a moment longer. Steam rose faintly from her sleeves where frost began to thaw under the first true light of morning. The compound seemed to breathe again. The sound of the flag cable against the pole resumed, a soft, metallic rhythm that marked the end of silence. Hale and Barrett stood where they were, not yet forgiven, but changed. Their pride had cracked under something stronger than reprimand. Example. Mallory's eyes followed Bishop's retreating figure, then drifted to the horizon. The mountains stood distant and calm, the air, finally, still. She exhaled once, the faint trace of breath vanishing in sunlight. The balance had been restored, not through authority enforced, but through respect earned. And as the compound returned to motion, discipline moving once again in quiet unison, the lesson remained true. Command begins in silence, and justice, when tempered by dignity, restores more than it removes. The morning light spread across the compound like a quiet benediction. Frost glistened on the ground where shadows still clung, but the sun had begun its slow reclaiming. Each breath hung in the air, softer now, drifting upward like smoke after battle. The training yard stood in perfect stillness, the echo of the previous day's reckoning frozen in memory and air alike. The Marines assembled once again, boots aligned, shoulders squared, posture exact, but the silence between them was no longer shame. It was waiting, not for punishment, but for understanding. Captain Erin Mallory stood before them, hands clasped lightly behind her back. The wind stirred the hem of her coat, the faint sound of fabric breaking the stillness. Her presence held calm, unforced command, not the sharp edge of authority, but the quiet depth of discipline. Sunlight caught on the faint trace of frost that still clung to her sleeve. She looked across the formation without judgment. The men who had once laughed now stood in rigid reflection, their eyes forward but their minds inward. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, listening. In that silence, truth carried louder than any reprimand could. The compound itself bore witness the frozen barrels from the prank now empty and glinting under sun, the footprints from the confrontation half buried under new frost. The memory was written into the ground. A scar, but also a lesson. Mallory stepped forward once, the motion deliberate. Her shadow stretched across the line of Marines, steady and long in the early light. If there was anger in her, it had long since been buried under composure. What remained was clarity, the kind that comes only after endurance. Leadership, she knew, wasn't built in comfort. It was tempered in restraint, in the ability to absorb humiliation without fracture, to respond to chaos with order. Every Marine before her had been trained to act, to react, to command motion under fire, but few had been taught the harder disciplined stillness. The wind passed gently through the formation, carrying the faint metallic clang of the flag cable against its pole. It sounded like cadence, slow, steady, unwavering. Mallory's gaze lingered on Hale and Barrett at the front. Their uniforms were immaculate, but their faces held something new. Humility, earned the hard way. They didn't need words from her. Their lesson was already written in silence. She turned slightly, the sun fully cresting the ridgeline behind her. The frost on the barrels began to melt, thin rivulets running into the gravel, cold giving way to clarity. It mirrored the shift among them, the thaw between pride and understanding. Her lesson unfolded not through speech, but through presence. The narrator of this moment would have called it composure under fire, but in truth it was something deeper, the moral calm of a leader who commands without dominance. The Marines straightened unconsciously. What began as atonement became alignment, their discipline returning not from fear, but from respect. Colonel Bishop watched from the distance, arms crossed, expression quiet. There was nothing to correct now. Order had returned not through enforcement, but through example. He understood that what these men had learned in one cold morning would outlast any manual or reprimand. Mallory raised her hand in salute, the motion smooth and unhurried. The formation mirrored her, a single synchronized gesture that carried more meaning than 100 shouted commands. In that collective motion, balance was restored. When her arm fell, the light had grown warmer. Steam rose from the thawing ground, curling around their boots in gentle motion. The compound seemed alive again, not with noise, but with purpose. Mallory turned, taking a final step across the gravel. Her pace was steady, her silhouette framed by the low sun. Behind her, the Marines remained at attention, unmoving, their breath rising together in unison. The sound of her boots faded slowly, replaced by wind and the soft rhythm of thawing ice. It was the sound of order rediscovered, of respect no longer demanded, but earned. And, as she crossed the edge of the compound, light surrounding her in quiet brilliance, her lesson lingered behind like a pulse in the air. Strength is silence mastered, leadership is restraint remembered, and composure is the truest mark of command. Dusk settled over the compound like a held breath. The air had lost its bite, though the cold lingered just enough to remind them what had been endured. The wind whispered through the empty lanes, carrying dust and the faint metallic hum of flag cables against their poles. The day's last light stretched long across the gravel, gold fading into gray. The yard was empty now, the formation dismissed, drills complete. Yet the space held memory, a residue of presence that refused to fade. Where Captain Aaron Mallory had once stood, the frost no longer clung. The ground there remained darker, thawed sooner than the rest, a mark of warmth left behind in a place defined by cold. Time had passed since that morning. The incident had become story, then instruction, then quiet legend. Her name was no longer spoken in rumor, but in respect, softly, the way one references something sacred. Among the platoon, her composure had become a model, not a myth of heroism, but a standard of conduct, calm before motion, control before command. A young Marine now stood at the same training lane where it all began. The light caught the edges of his gear, his breath steady against the chill. He waited for the order to begin, not impatient, not proud, just ready. When the signal came, he moved cleanly, efficiently, every motion deliberate, no wasted effort, no aggression, only focus. Observers watched in silence. The wind brushed their uniforms, lifting faint edges of dust. One of them noticed how the Marine paused before completing his drill, how he stilled himself, controlled his breathing, and only then acted. It was a small thing, but in that stillness, a legacy breathed. The sun dipped lower, casting the compound in muted light. Beyond the horizon, the mountains darkened to silhouettes, their peaks fading into the evening haze. The flag above the yard stirred once, then settled. Mallory was gone now, reassigned, her presence folded back into the vast quiet of service. Yet, what she left behind endured, not in orders or records, but in posture, in breath, in silence mastered. The camera would pull back here, the compound shrinking against the wide Montana dusk. The sound would fade to wind and memory. And in that final quiet, what remained was not her name, but her lesson. Leadership lives longest in silence kept, and composure is the echo that never dies.